Here are the directions for completing Project 1. If you go into your Project 1 folder, which covers 519 to 525, and you scroll down to the Project 1 materials folder, you're going to see the materials in here that you need to use. You're going to write your report based on the sample report that's in the sample report folder. But in this folder, you'll find the blank lesson plan form, right? And you're only going to be completing day 1 and day 2. You'll find the CVC variant word list. And what this is for is when you get into your teaching formats from Chapter 3, and you have picked a spelling pattern that you want to use based on your students' assessments, this is a great place to come to just find all of those words rather than trying to think about what words you should be using. So that's just something that's a resource for you. The Project 1 rubric is posted here, and it tells you exactly what I'm looking for. This is not discovery learning. These are the things that I want to see. I want it to look very much like John's report in terms of content and in terms of length. Do not get into big, long explanations about cognitive development and things like that, because that is beyond the scope of the assessments that you've given, and we call that over-interpreting your data or interpreting beyond your data. The next thing that you're going to find in here are this DIBELS Next benchmark goals. And when I get into the directions for the project in a few minutes, you will understand how this is to be used. But basically, the way that it works is you find the page that is based on your student's current grade level. So for those of you, most of you will be working with a first grader. You'll be using these end of the semester or end of the year scores to make decisions about your students. You will be looking at phonemic segmentation fluency, and we'll be using the beginning of the year for first grade if your student's a first grader, because typically for students who are not having trouble learning to read, we don't give the assessment again. So this is the highest level of norm reference data we have. So if you have a first grader at the end of the year who is only reading 26 correct phonemes per minute, then we know that this is a student who really is in trouble, because he or she would have been in trouble at the beginning of the year, and we can just report that information. You'll use end of the year for nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds, nonsense word fluency, whole words read. You are not going to be administering the oral reading fluency for your Project 1 kid. So these are the 3 scores right here, and right here. If you happen to be working with a second grader, which you have got to run by me because most second graders are not going to have a lot of problems in these areas, then you would use the phonemic segmentation fluency score from the beginning of first grade. You would use the nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds per minute score, and whole words read per minute score from the beginning of the year. Because again, we don't collect data on those skills after the beginning of second grade, because the vast majority of students will be at benchmark. The way that you read these lines, if a student is scoring at or above the score that's in the top line on any of these assessments, that's a student who is doing just fine based on their Tier 1 instruction. So we would describe them as being at or above benchmark. The next set of scores, if you have a student falling in the second line, which for most first graders would be right here based on your assessment data, this is a student who is not at benchmark. They're not significantly behind, but they're behind enough that we're worried about them. And so this would be a case where we would make a valid evidence-based argument for providing Tier 2 instruction in the phonics skills that undergird nonsense word fluency. Same here. If you have a student who is scoring at or below the third line within this range of scores, this is a student who needs Tier 3 instruction in the skill. There's no question about it. This is a student who is severely behind for whatever reason, and we are going to want to provide as much instruction as often as we can, as intensively as we can. This is a student who's going to be in Tier 3. The other 2 assessments that you give, the blending measure and the word attack measure, are not reported in terms of rate and accuracy. You only report them in terms of what the student was able to do and what the student was not able to do. There's no benchmark for those. Those are informal assessments. There are benchmarks for the DIBELS assessments because they've been norm referenced on about 10,000 kids. So we know that the scores that we see are have really high predictive validity. And the other two measures don't because they're informal, but they're really helpful in terms of planning your instruction. So this is the DIBELS Next benchmark sheet that gets referenced when you come over here to your directions for completing Project 1. This tells you exactly what you're supposed to do. The informal blending measure is the blending measure that you have in your DIBELS folder, and it's not a DIBELS assessment, it's an informal assessment, and there's a video in there that tells you exactly how to give it. The word attack assessment is the same thing. It's it's either word attack or beginning phonics assessment. I can't remember exactly how I labeled it this time, but they mean the same thing. And so these tell you the letter sounds and the spelling patterns that you're going to need to target for instruction. You're going to give the letter naming fluency assessment data. And for letter naming fluency, if you remember, letter naming fluency is really a measure of lexical recall. And so we just have a basic benchmark score of 25 correct letter names per minute, no matter what age the student is in, age or grade the student's in. So if they are at 25 or above, then the way that we report the data is that the student was able to produce X number of correct letter names per minute. Therefore, we believe that any difficulties with reading are unlikely to be due to problems with lexical recall. If you have a student who is doing less than 25 correct letter names per minute, no matter how old, and those of you who work with older kids might be surprised at how many older students can't pull that information out quickly and accurately. Regardless, if the student is not hitting that benchmark of 25, then we report the data as the student was able to correctly name X number of letter names per minute. This is below the generally accepted benchmark of 25 correct letter names per minute. Therefore, therefore something along the lines of difficulties with reading might have something to do with difficulties with lexical recall or difficulties with short-term memory. You come up with some language and look at the sample report. There's a sample sentence in there that you're free to use. So for the last two assessments, the phonemic segmentation fluency assessment data, based on your student's grade level, you're going to go to the DIBELS Next benchmark and composite score booklet that I just showed you before I clicked over into this document, and you're going to make decisions about whether the student is at benchmark, below benchmark, or well below benchmark. And remember that at benchmark means he or she's doing fine in Tier 1. Below benchmark means that we should think about some Tier 2. And well below benchmark means that we probably need to really think about Tier 3. Now, I will tell you that you will have students who are kind of all over the map, and sort of you're going to have to make a judgment call about putting them in Tier 2 or Tier 3 because some of the skills are in Tier 2 range, some of the skills are in Tier 3 range. In general, if the student's close or if you have reason to suspect that they may have been off on testing, we can try them in Tier 2. We're going to progress monitor them, and if in 6 weeks they're not making adequate progress, even in 3 weeks they're not making adequate progress, we can bump them down to Tier 3. The other argument that is totally valid and acceptable, you just have to make it, is that we're going to bump them into Tier 3 because we can always move them out as soon as we see they're making progress. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to do the same thing for nonsense word fluency. You will identify the student's present level of performance, and then you'll move into your instructional goal and objectives. Based on the assessments, you have to identify the skills for which your student is in need of direct instruction. Go back to Borsig and Damer and look at what your advanced organizer is going to look like. You can disregard the Sunday night piece. I just need you to submit the advanced organizer when you submit the entire project to me. Most students are going to need work with segmenting and blending. If you have doubts about that, get in touch with me once you've given your assessments and we can talk through it. this is a science and an art, and so sometimes we have to make decisions that aren't necessarily straightforward. We just have to have an effective rationale for why we're doing the instruction that we're doing. Most of you are going to be teaching some letter sounds. And every time we teach letter sounds, which is a reading skill, we also want to do the inverse skill, which is sound writing. And that's a precursor to spelling. So we would do that for any letter sounds that a student hasn't already mastered. Then we would get into regular word reading, and all regular word reading is comprised of letter sounds that students know with 100% accuracy. So on any given day, if you were working on introducing the letter D in your letter sounds portion of your lesson, you would not be able to use the letter D in any of your regular word reading because the student hasn't mastered it yet. This is where, for the beginning reader, the pieces of, or the CVC variant word list becomes really handy, because it can get hard and sort of bog you down to do try to think up all those CVC pattern words every single time. As we go from day 1 to day 2, we want to change up the words that we're working on to make sure that we're minimizing any chance that students have simply memorized words. We've got some really strong visual kids out there who can memorize stuff and not actually learn the pattern. The pattern is what we want them working on. Similarly to the sound writing letter sound inverse relationship, we also want our students working on spelling. Again, these would be words that are similar to the words that are in the regular word reading list, but not identical. And we're only going to ask students to spell words totally comprised of letter sounds they already know. So this would not be a place, if you were working on D up here in your letter sound instruction, there would be no words with D in your spelling instruction on that same day. Exception words are if you have a student who is ready to do some decodable story reading, they're going to encounter words like the and is and a and on if they haven't already mastered those patterns. Exception words, if you remember, are basically any words that students don't know the spelling pattern for, or they are irregular. So even though the word bit, B-I-T, is a regular word, it is a CVC word, if the student doesn't know the short sound of I, then that word would be an exception word, and we would have to teach it using the exception word format until such a time that the student had mastered all the individual letter sounds in those words. And then we would do some decodable story reading. You do not have to plan for all of these. I would like for you to plan for 4 to 6. We get into exception words and decodable story reading when we have students who, for instance, know all of their letter sounds and sound writing, and we're really working on regular word reading and spelling at the level of subvocal sounding out. So that frees up some time at the end to work on decodable story reading. If you have a child who is significantly behind, you don't need to get into decodable story reading right away. You can just plan your lessons for the first 6 skills. I want you to develop lesson plans for 2 teaching sessions. Use the model. You need to write in instructional objectives. Again, use the model in the sample project. And it's really important that you follow these guidelines when we're writing objectives. Separate objective for each skill. Be explicit. Define how the student will meet the objective. Identify the level of accuracy. We almost always want 100% here because these skills are so very important. And then we want students to be able to perform the skill with that really high level of accuracy for a certain number of days in a row. If it's something like a new letter sound, you can write the goal or the objective for 2 days in a row, because that letter is going to go into the review pack, and if the student starts missing it again in the review bank during your lesson, then it's going to go back in and be retaught anyway. If it's something like spell CVC words with short A, short E, and short I with 80% accuracy, that would be actually pretty appropriate, because that gives the student a little bit of wiggle room to make a careless error. But we want them to perform at that level for 4 to 5 days in a row, and if they can't do it, then we've got to go back and reteach. So use the lesson plan sheet that's in the sample project, and you have a copy of it here. You are welcome to cut and paste the format of the overall project from the John sample project, and you have to include the instructional examples, and you have to include all of the formats for the skills taught. there should be a one-to-one correspondence between the lesson plan and your instructional objectives, and you do not need to develop or submit to me the actual instruction materials, aside from the advanced organizer, for the purposes of this project, because you won't actually be implementing the project with the lessons with a student because of our time frame on Maymester. All right, thanks. Bye.